thank you very much indeed. I have to say I'm incredibly nervous being around such luminaries. My heroes and heroines are here. And so what I'll do is talk very fast. And in part, I'll talk very fast because there's a lot to get through. I mean, this title is just a mess, but it begs lots of questions like, what is the global food system? So maybe we'll start there with a question I often ask my students. And the student says, what is the most important agricultural innovation? Is it the plow? Is it fencing? Is it the seed drill? Is it inorganic fertilizer? Or is it genetically modified crops? Let me take a quick poll. Who thinks it's number one, the plow? Okay. Number two, fencing. Number three, the seed drill. Some fans of the seed drill, very good. Yeah, seed drill, invented by Jethro Tull. Just very exciting. Number four, inorganic fertilizer. And number five, genetically modified crops. Well, I would suggest to you that the answer is fencing. Now, the reason I think I would make this case is because without fencing, you don't have the conditions for innovation for all the rest of those things. Look, here's a map of Billingsley in England. And what fencing allowed to happen from the 1450s on, fencing was part of a complex of social technologies. You had debt. Henry VII imposed debt on landowners, and in order to repay that debt, they needed to enclose land that was once the commons. So they needed to exterminate the commons and create a space in which then they could start engaging in monoculture. And they removed the peasantry, who then had nothing to sell but their labor. With the advent of fencing, you create the conditions for innovation for everything up to genetically modified crops. So now here on these big green fields, you have the conditions for innovation for new kinds of agricultural technology. But that's only made possible by debt and fencing. And you need you need also other social technologies to be able to feed the workers who are in cities. You create these webs of trade and colonialism. You create settler colonies like the one in which we find ourselves now, and the one in which I work, of course, the United States and Canada, of course, the world's largest settler colony. So you create these massive technologies of displacement alongside the technologies of provisioning cheap food for workers in cities. And of course, the elites who benefit from that do very well. This is, unfortunately, it's a little dark, but this is a terrific painting. It's Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. You see it in the National Gallery in London. What's really interesting about this painting, you can't see it too well, so I'll just have to walk it through, but you see fences back there. There are some sheep that have displaced the peasants. You have nice straight rows of crops that have been put there by modern seed technology. This guy, Mr. Andrews, was an agricultural expert. He had several journal articles published on agricultural technology. Super interesting, of course, is Mrs. Andrews. One of the features of enclosure was transformation in gender dynamics. And the way that many geographers view this painting is as a painting of ownership. If you see Mr. Andrews, he's kind of like this. And he's wearing his hunting gear. This is it's like he's wearing tracksuit. He's wearing his tracksuit bottoms and a Kiss the Chef T-shirt or something. He's super informal. Whereas Mrs. Andrews is as owned and as corseted as the land around here. Now that's very interesting because her role now is to provide care. She is relegated to the domestic sphere. There's a policing of what she does, and the fences, of course, exclude the workers. You don't see any workers here. You see the fruits of their labor. Oh, that's better. So you see the fruits of their labor. You see the corn sort of baled up nicely, but the workers have been expelled. Their social costs have been kicked off the land, and instead you have this sort of picture of what modern agriculture looks like. And this is a cutting-edge farm. I mean, these seeds were put here using a seed drill 100 years before the seed drill became really technologically popular. And of course, there's a corollary to this, which is in order to provide cheap food for workers in cities who've been displaced by this enclosure, you need colonialism. And this, of course, we find ourselves on Ndebele land, but this is a picture of the most glorious of uprisings. This is the Haitian Revolt. The painting was painted in when was it? 1844. The rebellion was from 1791 to 1804. But this is what the modern food system both spawned and was designed to contain. Right? The modern food system is built not to feed the masses, but in fact it's built to provide cheap food for people in cities. And not just cheap food. I mean, when you have your fences, you externalize a whole bunch of things. And of course, this is a sort of geography of externalization when it comes to carbon. But I do find this incredibly interesting, that what fences and what the processes of international trade allow is the externalization of costs, of environmental costs, and of making nature cheap. And so the lives and the nature in China are cheapened so that the carbon footprint of the United States, of Europe, and of elsewhere can be exported, and China suffers the pollution and is labeled a climate criminal, so that people in the United States and elsewhere can have cheap stuff. So if there's an important slide in this presentation, it's this. Cheap workers need cheap care, need cheap food, need cheap energy, needs cheap nature. There's a complex here. When you create the sort of conditions around governance that generate this, by the way, the dollar burger, I write about it a little bit in the Valley of Nothing. If you internalize all the environmental costs of this burger, the burger shouldn't cost $1, it should cost nearer $200. But you need the cheap food in order for people to be able to feed their families, in order for people to care for one another, to be able for parents to be able to put food on the table for their children. You need, in order for the price to be $1, you need to externalize the environmental costs, and you need workers to be paid next to nothing in order for all of that to happen. So you see how there's a complex here of reproductive labor, of environment, and of food, and it's kind of embodied in this. And this leaves the food industry in a particularly interesting place. This was put together by the bomb-throwing anarchists at KPMG. What they do is, very conservatively, estimate the environmental costs of various industries as a proportion of profit. And the food industry is the biggest tragedy here. This is their profit, $89 billion, but their environmental costs are 224% of their profits. And this is KPMG talking, this isn't me. And I find that very interesting, because if we're interested in a world where innovation happens, where the food industry has a role, then they can't do what they do under any circumstances, given the way that the world economy is now arranged, right? That I think is just, this is just to set up the story of what the world food system is. So that leads us to the competing ways of governing the food system. And you won't have to guess much at what I think of the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. But this is one option that has emerged as a way of governing the food system, and it was offered initially by under the Obama presidency of the G8 in 2012. And they came up with this idea of we need a new alliance of food security and nutrition. And the guy who was head of USAID at the time, his name was Raj Shah. And he kind of sold this new alliance in this way. He said, look, we are never going to end hunger in Africa without private investment. There are things that only companies can do, like building silos for storage and developing seeds and fertilizers. He said that in May 2012. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that's entirely incorrect. If you think about who is it that builds silos for storage, who develops seeds, who develops fertilizers, invariably, those things in the past, if you have a history of the Green Revolution, those things were done by foundations. They were done not by the private sector, but by the public sector and by philanthropists. But today, that history has been forgotten, and the private sector is now the only one who can save us. And so with this new alliance of food security and nutrition, the idea is that their ambitious goal is to lift 50 million people from poverty by 2020. And they'll do this by mobilizing private capital, taking innovation to scale, and managing risk. That's what David Cameron was leading with when he was at the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. This was at the G8 summit in London in 2013. And you can see that the vision here is beating hunger through business and science. Right? That's the pitch for the New Alliance now. Now, it was, I mean, one of the big partners, of course, was the Business Alliance for Food and Fortification. It was an alliance set up in 2005 by Coke, Danone, Unilever, and a range of others. And they said, look, we can help with hunger in Africa. It's not really hunger that's the problem, it's malnutrition. And with malnutrition, what we can do is, well, companies already own the right technology to make a difference, as well as the distribution networks and distribution channels and communication networks. And so essentially the vision that business has is, let us fix hunger in Africa. I mean, Coke took a stab at this by, there was a big kind of backlash against Coke. I mean, there's always a backlash against Coke, but there was a particular backlash against Coke recently because, what does Coke sell that is any good? And Coke said, well, no, we understand that the people want more nutritious products. And so in the United States, they brought in something called Diet Coke Plus. Have people heard of Diet Coke Plus? Okay, so Diet Coke Plus is regular Diet Coke, but then they add vitamins and minerals, right? So basically it tastes like a chemistry set. It still has 0 calories, but you can carry on through the day and still have 50% of your recommended daily allowance. Now, I mean, it's a bit weird, but hang on with me. So this is the Business Alliance for Food and Fortification. They've been going for a while, and they've been really interested in a very a sort of key shift when thinking about malnutrition. When I was growing up, if someone said, malnutrition costs $5 billion a year, you would have thought that they were slightly unhinged or unethical. Right? But when you say malnutrition costs many billions of dollars a year, you are transforming what is an abrogation of people's human right to food and turning it into something that, and pricing it. But the thing is that when you price it, all of a sudden, certain kinds of interventions become thinkable, like fortification. And so when a new literature really emerged in the 1990s with the World Bank tackling the problem of malnutrition, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the World Bank found itself intellectually free to do whatever it liked. And so it started applying some basic sort of cost-benefit analyses to the problem of nutrition. And all of a sudden, you started being able to do some modeling where it's like, well, this much money can be saved by doing this kind of intervention. And all of a sudden, the private sector's, it was like a dog whistle. The private sector's ears perked up, and they saw a role for them as bringers of nutrients in the food products that they were already making. Now, a lot of people criticize this new alliance for food security and nutrition, and they criticize it and they say, well, actually, you say that this is going to be about food and ending hunger, but actually, it's just about a new form of colonization. And if you look at the data, if you look at who it is that's investing the most in this new alliance, it's the Norwegian fertilizer company Yara. And they've upped this shows them at $1.5 billion. They're now near $3 billion because they have a vision of how it is that they're going to invest in Africa that's going to be through increased fertilizer. But what's interesting about this graph isn't the fact that Europeans are coming in and recolonizing Africa. But actually, two things. Well, first of all, this is provided by the organization, the civil society organization that's about ending hunger in Africa. And I want to flag that just because when we talk about civil society, not all civil society is the same. And this particular civil society organization found itself on the side of large corporations. But also, one said, well, yes, of course, all this green stuff's bad, but look at here, look, that Tanzania has its own thing and Cote d'Ivoire has its own thing. So it's not just about other people doing things to Africa, it's also about endogenous African investment. Though it turns out that this Tanzania figure was, in fact, a shell company for a Norwegian one. So never mind. But I do want to flag that just because when we think about civil society as this sort of force for good when it comes to hunger, we need to be a little more critical about that. Now, one of the things that happened at that summit where David Cameron was effusing about the cost of hunger to the world economy, Malawi signed up. Joyce Banda signed her company up to this to the New Alliance. And when you look at the document, Malawi has only to do 3 things as part of the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. So I just want to remind you, this is an alliance about food security and nutrition, and the commitments are, number 1, improved score on Doing Business Index into the top 100. By the way, the Doing Business Index is an incredibly pernicious thing, right? I mean, it's a way in which the World Bank doesn't have to make you do something, you do it to yourself. It's the way in which, like, certain religious communities think about God from the sky, looking down, and you don't want to offend God, so you do the right thing because you've always got your eye cocked up at him. That's what the Doing Business Index is. It's a way of policing from a distance, and countries, India in particular, has gone out of its way to kind of game the index so that by abrogating workers' rights, by making it easier to pollute the environment, so that doing business is easier. The second thing, of course, is increased dollar value of private sector investment in the agriculture sector and value-added agro-processing. And the third thing is increased private investment in commercial production, sale of inputs and produce, and value addition. So that's how we're going to fight malnutrition. This is an alliance for food security and nutrition, and these are the 3 things that Malawi absolutely has to do, and the rest is optional. So the question you might ask is, well, why is it called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition? Now, I mean, some people say, look, actually, this is nothing but a colonial land grab, and it's just wrong. But it's important to take this idea of nutrition seriously, because nutrition has been turned into nutritionism. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Georgi Skrinis, for example. He's an academic operating out of Australia, but he points out that nutritionism is this sort of fetishization of vitamins as a way of distracting a conversation about poverty and turning it into a project of fortification. And of course, there are 2 things that Malawi has to do, well, not has to do, but can do and has committed at some point in the future doing. The first is iodizing salt. So as part of this new alliance, what they're going to do is iodize salt, which is a great idea in general. I mean, iodizing salt is a good idea, but it helps if you can afford to buy salt. And that's not something that's part of the conversation. The other thing, which I think is super interesting, is this. I don't have it's hard to find a picture of maternity leave, but this is a picture of maternity leave. The idea here is that Malawi will, at some point in the future, commit to extending the maternity leave of women in formal employment from 8 to 12 weeks, which is absolutely a tremendously important thing. It gets at that cheap care thing. It tries to value care. The trouble is that Malawi has made no commitment for when it's going to happen. Again, this is an optional thing. But I do think it's interesting when we think about nutrition that these are the 2 kinds of ways that Malawi is going. The trouble is, I mean, it has rather been a land grab. I mean, and there's a politics to this that I find very pernicious. When David Cameron was up on stage, he was preceded by 2 young people, Frank and Mwajuma. This is Frank and Mwajuma. We were never told their second names, but their role was to come up on stage and say, we have survived malnutrition, and we demand that you, the leaders of the world, do something about it. But when you have Frank and Mwajuma coming up on stage, what you do is transform the role of people who are suffering malnutrition. Really, all you have to do is show their broken bodies and then leave it to the experts to figure out, right? You're showing the bodies. It's like habeas corpus. You show the body, and then they are not allowed to say anything. Their opinions matter not at all. And I feel like what this new alliance does is, obviously it's a technocratic exercise. It's about putting power in the hands of just a few people. And it reduces Africans who are suffering malnutrition into silence, or into people who are supplicants for aid. And of course, this vision of social change, this vision of how to govern Africa and how to solve the food system's problems were protested. This is the era of poverty with added vitamins. What they were offering is, look, we'll let Nestle sell its biscuits, but they will have, they'll be fortified. We'll have fortified salt. We'll have a range of, we'll keep things as they are, but we will add vitamins to the way that things are going. But we'll never talk about poverty. And that was protested. I mean, even when in the G8 met in London, there were people fighting that these broad corporate sort of sweeps for transformation. And there's not an organization that does that better, in my view, than this international peasant movement, La Via Campesina. Are people familiar with La Via Campesina? If you haven't heard of La Via Campesina, it's a movement of 200 million farmers, landless workers, laborers, who have a very different vision of what the food system should look like and how it should be governed. And so what I want to do now is just move us into thinking about what that is. We've understood that the food system is producing certain kinds of innovation. We have understood that the food system and the food corporations are in it for the money, and they've figured out ways of inserting themselves with particular ways of governing this problem. And now what I want to do is suggest an alternative. And to suggest that alternative, we need to think about what happened in Malawi in 2000. So just some sort of stylized figures. Life expectancy in Malawi in 2000 was 46 years old and falling. It was in the middle of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. The prevalence was 14%. Child malnutrition, measured as stunting, was at 50%. And the GDP per capita was $150, less than 50 cents a day. And there was a nurse leader in a pediatric clinic in northern Malawi, in Ekwindeni, who knew that there's a problem here, right? She saw the children coming in, and the children were coming in because all they were eating was the staple crop in Malawi, which is corn, maize, right? So I have to say maize here, don't I? So maize is the staple crop in Malawi. And so she needed to be able to diversify the crop. The trouble is that because Malawi had been in such crippling debt, illegitimately gotten, the agricultural extension services had been shrunk. There was no support to be able to diversify the diet. And luckily, there was a young graduate student who was there at the time. Her name's Rachel Besner-Kerr. She's my collaborator on much of this work. And she helped find seeds, and they started what they called a farmer research group. So there were 187 farmers who had these seeds, and they were encouraged to go out and experiment. And they had soybeans, they had mukuna, they had a range of different crops and a range of different ideas about how to grow these things. And they grew this project from 187 to 3,000 farmers in the first 5 years. And everyone, what was super interesting about this is that these farmer research groups got together, and they had fantastic crops that were fixing nitrogen in the soil. They had soybeans, for instance. And then they were growing, they were intercropping legumes with maize and with squash. Squash has big leaves, so it shades out the weeds. And and you get squash as well. So and this agricultural system is called the Three Sisters in Latin America, where originally it was started. And so corns, beans, and squash. It's fantastic. And they also did other things. They planted nitrogen-fixing trees because climate change is such a reality in Malawi that it sometimes gets too hot in the fields, and providing shade cover can increase yields by 15%. So this becomes an important kind of farming technology. And they worked this out, they exchanged, they discovered, and in the end, they grew as much maize as before, and maize levels comparable to using fertilizer in industrial agriculture. But they also grew between 50 and 70% more protein. So you have more maize and more protein. And this is the bit where I turn it over to you. It's possible for there to be more food and for infant malnutrition to go up. This is one of the problems that the farmer research team was wrestling with. There was more maize and more protein, and infant malnutrition was in danger of going up. Why? Distribution. Well, no, because this is done on their own field, so it's right there. The maize and the beans, they're right there. But how can you get more food coming out of the ground and infant malnutrition goes up? Feeding it to the animals. Livestock is a part of the agriculture system, but people aren't that dumb. They would rather eat the food themselves than feed it to the animals. So how do you have more food? Come on, people, more food, and infant malnutrition can go up. Wrong type of food. Well, it's there is this sort of myth of peasant conservatism, right? Where peasants, they're like, oh no, they only stick to what they know. But if you go to a garden in Malawi, you'll find, okra, you'll find aubergine, you'll find tomatoes, you'll find, New World, Old World crops from all over the damn place. Plus, this is protein. This is great food. Come on, more food coming out of the fields, and infant malnutrition goes up. Eating too much, what? Sorry. Obesity? No. Well, I mean, that's no. In short, no. Sorry? Poor storage. Storage, of course, we know about food waste is an incredibly important problem. But they've actually, that's not the reason why. But the food storage issue is something that they've been able to tackle. Yeah. Higher prices. It's true that actually the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition created markets in some of these products. For example, in Tuor Dal, one of the big offenders in the New Alliance in Malawi is India. India wants to find new markets to be able to source Tuor Dal to export to India. But that's not the reason. Come on. Governance, no. Population, no. Exports, no. Oh, for the love of... Fences, no. And not even debt. All right, I will tell you. So first of all, this is what an agroecological field looks like, but the answer is harvesting is women's work. Now, harvesting is women's work, but so is cooking and cleaning and fetching firewood and breastfeeding. And so if the amount of harvesting goes up because you've got more stuff, to harvest, and you still need to cook, and you still need to clean, you still need to fetch water, then breastfeeding is a thing that can go down. So that's why it's possible to have more food in the field and for infant malnutrition to go down, is because breastfeeding is the thing that's sacrificed under this regime of harvesting. So, does everyone get that? So how do you solve that problem? Make the men work. No, it's important to note, the reason that harvesting is women's work is because women are keen to control the harvest. It's the income stream. They're worried in some cases that men will sell the harvest and then drink. It doesn't happen often, but being able to control the income stream, it's important. So it's a concern. So you don't want men to harvest. You want to get men to cook. How do you do that? Go on strike, the Oresteia, starve the men. They were a little kinder than that. So again, these farmer research teams, men and women, got together, and initially, they did an experiment called, it's like the Food Network experiment, let's call it that. Do you have the Food Network here, or the Food Channel, or the Cooking Channel? People, in the United States, it's a channel dedicated to people eating food and occasionally cooking it. The idea is that with this Food Network approach, a nutritionist and a community leader would go around to a particular house and they would say, "Man of the house, come over here. You may have seen this before. You may have seen your wife hunched over it. It's a pot." And the man's like, "Yeah, well, I've often wondered how that works." And then there would be a cooking lesson, and people would be, and it would be joyful, and the food would be delicious, and then. Just like watching the Food Network, you watch it for entertainment, you don't watch it for life transformation. And so little happened there. And so they came up with a different idea. And it's called the Recipe Day. And this was an idea that emerges from this peer-to-peer network of farmer research groups. And the idea of the Recipe Day is this, that you have about 100 families, and you bring them, 100 people come together, men, women, and children, and everyone cooks together. And what you do there is create a space of equality. It's like a prefigurative community, a community where it's possible for men to teach other men how to cook. It becomes possible for people to have difficult conversations. It becomes possible for women to call men out on our patriarchy, for example. It becomes a space where mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law can have difficult conversations about feeding practices. One of the sort of legacies of colonialism is that eating oats was considered good weaning practice at 2 months. And so these conversations happen in the Recipe Day. And the Recipe Day provides us this joyful, collective, gamified. If you're familiar with this idea of gamification, it becomes a way of playing and a way of experimenting together. And it's followed up by tough feminist organizing, where women go door to door and, and support their sisters in the process of empowerment. And if that sounds a little abstract, then let me show you what it looks like. This is a clip from the film, and it is, I'm kind of keen to show you, it's just a few minutes, and then I'll fly through to the end. But this is what the recipe days look like.
Tanguikako soda na tushuga pachoko waka na mafuta tangutirapo pasi pachoko na tumchere taikako sota taikako vile ambweni tukuika pa moto
pasazi kutapa vapsha mbatu kutora mafuta tukuika pa moto pasifria na kuika pa moto
mama tiri wakukondwa isela mama tiri wakukondwa imwe mama mwera imwe mama mwera nibana Chaya.
Tindanjire mu Bungwe chifukwa nkuwerezeka Bungwe chifukwa ndikukwawa ngekufumira mikoka yitu tikakhalanga mokusuzikira vose vinthu kabwiranga ndini kwakuyana nawe tikupika kupenja dende kwali kulima kukucherera kukaye inatengevanya na kubeka inachereranga ndine mlenje kwako kuti tatola kuma 2000 kweni nyengo yose ya kumanyuma vanga vakuti para ine nina nthumbo nyake mwana wali kumusana tacherera tose kumunda ndikuti pati kufuma kumunda tikwenda iwo vanyani vakwenda waka kuchopo akambaka pano ndikuti pati tafika pano vanyumba mbwenu wakukhala waka pampando hapo chete kweni kwa sono na tikanjira mu Bungwe vakatisamiza vajenda kuti mwanarume angagwira ntchito za chanakazi. Mbuto hii ni za soni ni ila mkapoka kwa imwesha kweni icho chikumbika nchauti nge mungalimbikiranga na ngauli kamba pachoko udongo linga sintha nyengo ineyo icha
watukuona watu mlanyitu tukukwe vili monadi kweni kuno kwitu ndikutanga takhalira
kuno mwakhalira nandi ndipo so hapo vikusuzika chomene kuno mwanyitu mwanarume chigaya chinu chitu chakubwako mungu vipulikisika makoracha vajenda ngenganira tikayanga po daziro para mulamu muchari kukaika
isi tingakwanisi na mwe sanga watereka nkhari
kwechi kwa cha kusuze ya mulamu chwa cha kusuze ya munga chepe chamba
so wanyani vafika tatamcheza mwe sanga kuti ninafukaza mbweni ndi Mungwene kwe icho chujipikira mwanakazi wali para nani
ya ivanga seka ya mulamu kutola mukuona mulamu oro mu Bible viri kulembeka kuti nikupangirenge moviri uyu wakalenga Adamu chiuta akalenga Adamu na kuyoya kuti wakasanga kuti munthu lawana phukwa uchitachita wakukhalakhala kuti nikupangirepo moviri munthu wakuti wakuovirengeko mwanakazi dango lake ni isi tiwa uviri va iwo nandi
so kuti muleke vana nchakusuzwa lekanili mbani peni papa kweniwa kuti ntimwana wafuma kuti ndikukapo kwenkhanana tikasopana ukapo ana nivikile njani suzwa iyi iwo kuinga kumowa mwakazi nango towa pa nyumba kweni mbwe ngasanga kuti ipo nikhale nilele vana kulekera vanyako vana vangakwanisika cha suzwa iyi papa kale inengani niko mpakana iwo ndio vashitwa vao ndio kwa kavambula kuti kuyana na ina mpakana.
So that was the story up until last year. So let me fill you in on a couple of things. First of all, you saw Winston asking, well, what if my buddies saw me about cooking? And that's a concern for men who, I mean, this is about patriarchy being transformed, and the recipe day makes it possible to imagine that different. But it's also, it's also about recognizing this patriarchy and just moving away from it, and he's found that particularly hard. And the thing is, though, that this isn't couples, this isn't wives therapy, this is women's empowerment. And what's happened here is that for Jennifer, she has now become a community leader herself. Her husband hasn't undergone the kinds of transformation that other men in the village have. But she is now a leader in the village. She is teaching agroecology to women who are less fortunate than she is. And so she's achieved the goal of being self-sufficient and standing on her own 2 feet, even if her husband hasn't been part of that solution. And I think that's the important thing to take away from this story, is that these transformations are not easy. And there's no sort of single magic bullet. Participating in a recipe day is joyful, but the hard organizing afterwards is hard. But it has demonstrable results. I mean, in terms of the outcomes from here, participating in recipe days and the follow-up organizing has reduced malnutrition. I can explain that more simply. Participating in these recipe days isn't just about learning how to cook. It's about building a community, and it's about learning how to become activists together. And so, for example, they've demanded better sanitation and healthcare and gotten it from the government as a result of organizing together. As a result of organizing together, they've solved that storage problem, which is a very serious issue, and they've figured out ways of managing their own grain stores to be able to provide counter-cyclical availability of grain. So in the hunger season, people are able to make their own grain, to be able to get back their own grain at cheap prices from a storage facility that they control. They've also figured out ways of managing credit and finance together. So the credit clubs provided, particularly women, with access to a great deal more money than they would get from the private sector, and it was all going very well until the IMF devalued the currency. And they've also taken on climate change. One of the women in a trip down south saw what she called, she was told were climate change stoves, but basically clay stoves that allowed the use of just much less wood than compared to an open fire. And these stoves are being made by the women not only for their own cooking and for the men's cooking, but also to be sold for extra cash. And the bottom line is that they've been so successful through all of this, not only through the recipe day, not only through the transformation of gender dynamics in the home, but through the range of other things that this organizing has made possible, that the pediatric malnutrition clinic has closed in this area for want of cases. So while malnutrition rates globally are 40% and 50% in Malawi, here there aren't enough cases to justify having a malnutrition clinic. And all of this has been done for $8 per person per year. 17,000 farmers have gone through this process. And it's an incredible example of a different way of governing the food system. And this isn't something that's just relevant to Malawi. women's empowerment as a mechanism for fighting malnutrition has already been demonstrated to be globally important. Lisa Smith and Lawrence Haddad came out with a paper this year, for example, demonstrating that if you look at the ways to fight malnutrition, if you're serious about malnutrition, ending malnutrition, then there are some very clear drivers of that. Access to safe water, sanitation, increasing dietary energy supply is actually a tiny, tiny part of that. And diversifying the diet is important too. But actually, the key things are women's secondary education, and then the gender life expectancy ratio is a sort of proxy for women's empowerment. And 45% of hunger in South Asia, of child stunting in South Asia, the reductions in that can be attributed to women's empowerment. So again, if you're serious about malnutrition, if you're serious about an alliance for food security and nutrition, then it doesn't look like what Coke and friends are offering. It looks much more like what we're seeing in Malawi. And it looks more like food sovereignty and agroecology. I mean, agroecology, we've heard a little bit about it today. Agroecology was the kind of farming system that you saw in Malawi, where you're intercropping, where you're rotating, where you're burying crop residue. And these are techniques not just to increase yield and to increase dietary diversity, but to be autonomous from buying seeds from outside, and also to be able to, again, to be able to manage your soil in a time of climate change. It's a climate change adaptation technique, and it works very well. But food sovereignty is this term that people bandy around and not really clear on. I mean, food sovereignty is about community control over food policy. Food security is when you have enough food for a healthy life. But you can be food secure in prison. Right? Food security is the sort of thing where if you are in prison, you get 3 squares a day and you are food secure, but you're still in prison. Food sovereignty is about getting out of that prison. Food sovereignty is about being in control of what the food system looks like. And food sovereignty is the governance innovation that I'm very keen to be able to share with you, and to suggest that it's a way around this complex of cheap food, cheap land, cheap labor, cheap energy, and cheap care. And again, this whole story was about cheap care as well. This is about understanding that in order to transform the food system, we need to take reproductive labor seriously. This isn't just about growing more food, it's about transforming the entire dynamic of the food system. So when you think about Mrs. Andrews in that Gainsborough the Gainsborough painting, what we're seeing here is a sort of transformation of that 500 years of history. So what's interesting about this is, just to sort of sum it up, everyone in this story is a scientist. Everyone, I mean, this is peer-to-peer science. This isn't about experts providing the science. Once you show Frank and Mwajuma, and the scientists will come in and say, we're going to fix Frank and Mwajuma by giving them this fortified biscuit. This is about everyone becoming a scientist, and an entrepreneur, and an activist, and a cook. And what we saw, I mean, the way this proceeded was was about experiments. People were experimenting and iterating those experiments, and they were internalizing the social and environmental costs. And what they're engaged in is, this is an idea that I've seen recently, and it was explained to me as part of agroecology. It's this idea of contributive justice. So restorative justice, people may know, like when there is a harm carried out, the idea of restorative justice is you have to make it better. You have to just make things so that they were before the status quo. But what if the status quo sucks? What if the status quo is wrong? What if there's something, even before that injustice was carried out, things were pretty shitty? The idea of contributive justice is a way of thinking about labor and one's work in the community as building something better than the status quo. And I heard it in this context, because people say agroecology, like you can go on about agroecology all you like, but you have to admit that agroecology is hard work. That's why the women are suffering, is because it's really hard work. And I mean, hands up here who's had a shit job. Okay. There are a few lucky people here who are either asleep or... anyway, so I mean, if you've had a shit job, you know that the work was drudgery. It was just the same damn thing over and over again. But when I interviewed a number of people in Cuba about agroecology, what they were saying is, this is the hardest work I've ever done, but it's never not been rewarding. There's been something about this work where I feel like I'm building the soil, I'm building the community, I'm engaged. This is part of me being contributing to the world rather than being exploited by it. And this idea of contributive justice, I think, is tremendously important because it provides a way of unlocking this question about drudgery and about how we are in control of our own labor. And I think that, again, nobody thinks that farm work is terribly romantic, but there is a sort of second-order issue of being able to contribute to something much better and bigger than you're able to get just by being exploited in a monoculture. Because you're able to order your work, you're able to order the priorities, you're able to engage. I mean, monoculture and monocultural agriculture is part of the global division of labor, where you just do one thing, right? This agroecology is part of a diversification and a way of reclaiming the right to have meaningful work. And that's what contributive justice is, and that's what they were involved with. It was also joyful. You know, again, when we're thinking about we were having this conversation earlier on, thinking about indicators, and how it is that we get people to get excited about indicators and excited about the transformations that are ahead that are really very, very difficult. And joy is an integral part of this. You know, the recipe days work because everyone's having so much fun. That, you know, this is the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down, but it's also actually the fact that you can have fun in cooking and the food is much better than you get through industrial agriculture. But it's tough, and that feminist organizing is tough. I mean, it's about the carrot and the stick. I mean, you think about how, we live under a hegemony already. I mean, we live under oppressive states, but we're given little baubles, little trinkets, in order to make us, you know, come along. It's a counter-hegemonic approach where you have pleasure, you have the vision of the possible world, but you also have the tough organizing that makes it possible for for us to become less patriarchal, for us to recognize our patriarchy, to name it, and to be able to figure our way out of it in solidarity with the women who are fighting against it. So I think that this idea of sort of joy and tough organizing is tremendously important if we're thinking about a sort of counter-hegemonic ways of governing. And of course, it's peer-to-peer. You know, I mean, just to sort of celebrate Michelle's work, but also to understand that, I mean, if we're thinking about a world where we can, you know, where we flatten governance structures, then it has to be peer-to-peer. And in that way, it's about relearning the commons. Remember the commons that were smashed in that first, in the moment of enclosure. This is a very direct, real, physical way of people relearning the commons and relearning the arts of commoning together. This isn't just about having the land, but it's also about learning the arts of how we govern one another and, you know, govern for the best. And this is the art of commoning. And, you know, in order for that to happen, we need to challenge power and inequality. I mean, this is there's a sort of sine qua non of all of this organizing, is that challenging power and inequality is kind of a given. So I just want to end with some questions, because this is a fantastic example. It's spreading through Malawi. But there's some tough organizing ahead. So I've got Gandhi there just because I know his history is being revised in South Africa at the moment. But I think it's important to recognize that Gandhi was a foodie. This is him on the Salt March. And the Salt March, of course, is a tremendously interesting moment where you had the anti-colonial struggle, and decolonization is absolutely a part of what of this transformation. But you have an anti-colonial struggle that's about food and about people's ability to be able to make their own, free of the debt that is imposed on them. So what's interesting for me here is that he's taking on food, he's taking on debt, he's taking on colonialism. He's taking on some of the histories that have shaped the modern food system. But there are still important questions that Gandhi had his own theory of change. But I wonder what ours is. I mean, in Malawi, the theory of change is definitely a sort of grassroots bubble up, where more and more farmers it's moving from the north to the south of Malawi. More and more farmers are getting involved in this process of agroecology and food sovereignty. But we also need the top part of the sandwich. Lorenzo and I were talking about this. If we imagine social change being top down and bottom up, but there's some tremendous bottom-up stuff happening, but the top-down, stopping corporate power. I mean, La Via Campesina has ideas about that, but we need, everyone who's interested in this needs to be able to articulate what that theory is, and particularly in understanding what happens to corporate power. It's one of the reasons why this example is able to flourish is because corporations haven't taken an interest in this particular bit of Malawi because the land is so crappy. The bits that corporations are interested are well irrigated. They're the best land, it's the land that's open for the land grabs. This land has been historically marginalized, and so some of these experiments are able to flourish there. But if we're interested about this spreading seriously, then we need to address what corporate power, how to address that corporate power. And we therefore need to understand what happens to private property. I mean, the idea of the land grab is made possible by the idea of private property, and that's the original sin of the modern agricultural system. Having an answer to that question is, it seems to me, one of the deep, deep problems in addressing this new vision of governance in the food system. But the answer to that, it seems to me, will come through theory, through an understanding of the way people can govern private property relationships. And there's some hope that I want to end on. It's just one of my favorite quotes ever. And it comes from the Caribbean historian C.L.R. James, which is that every cook can govern. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you.
All right, so we have some time for Q&A. I'd ask if it's possible to turn on the lights again so that we get to see each other. And so we have plenty of time, if that's okay with you. And I'd like to see a show of hands. I'm going to take a few rounds. So the first 3 hands I see already. Is there a fourth one, or I start with these 3? There's a fourth one over there. So I'm going to start from the gentleman here. Please introduce yourselves and name, and if you're affiliated with any organization, please say so.
Grab some paper.
And 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Josiah Gumede, and I'm studying here at University of Pretoria. Mr. Raj Patel, you mentioned hegemonic power. Here in this country, we also have a food issue, the land reform issue. Do you think that in this country we need to actually break such a hegemonic order in order to enable everybody to produce food, to secure food, food supply, or to be independent, and or do we just need to actually replace that hegemonic order with another one? Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa. The mic is coming.
Hi. Lisa Pretoria from Govern. You mentioned that this project was successful, and one of the reasons was because it was marginalized land, which corporates aren't really interested in. What happens with the land that corporates are really interested in, and what's the dynamic there? Who wins out?
So then we had a lady here, second row, in the middle. You can use this.
My name is Lilibet Moorman. I'm actually a consumer activist. You started your talk with about fencing that made all the difference. But you never talked about fencing at the end of your talk again. What difference has it made in Malawi, and what difference will it make in South Africa? I was talking about the old homelands.
Great. Then we have the second row there.
John Kotopoulos, also with GovIn, but happening to be living in Malawi, the warm heart of Africa, which I recommend everyone should visit at some point. It's a really beautiful place, but one also that is clearly a very poor place. I'm just going to play devil's advocate with you. Of course, the corporate dimension, justifiably, you criticize. I wonder if someone could criticize even that initiative, which personally I find impressive, but if they could criticize that as, again, an imposition from the outside, arguably a Western imposition, maybe not imposition is the right word, but certainly an idea that comes from an outside, which, so it's a top-down initiative to change circumstances in a country that's a very conservative one and may change on its own in a different manner.
That's terrific. Okay, can I
second round
go for those 4 questions? Yep. Well, thank you. So, to the point that this is changing gender dynamics is a form of imperial intervention. Bear in mind, these experiments came from within the community itself. Rachel Besnicker, who's the Canadian who's involved, brought seeds, and everything else comes from within that community. I mean, she's been fundraising as well to be, so that there's been money to be able to make this happen. But the idea of a recipe day, she didn't come up with. No one knows who came up with it. It was one of these things that emerged in the meeting. And I think meetings are tremendously important. I mean, again, there's nothing sexy about meetings. But in fact, that's where social change happens. And it was an endogenous process. And it came from the women who were sick and tired of this particular, of patriarchy. I don't think, one has to look very far to find people who are unhappy with patriarchy. And what was interesting was not only was it identified in the farmer research meetings, but the solutions were iterated in those meetings as well. But I do think that, that's a way of trying to create another kind of hegemony. So to get to your point, I'm still staggered by the fact that since the end of apartheid, 5% of the land in South Africa has been transferred from whites to blacks, and the rest is exactly as it was. That figure is, it seems to me, a scandal. Now, when one thinks about, well, what are you going to replace that with? It seems to me when you think about hegemony, there's no way of escaping hegemony. It's always hegemony and counter-hegemony. You always live in a hegemony. You always live in an era of coercion and consent. That's kind of how it works. I mean, even the commons is about, the threat of exclusion, for example, from the commons, together with the joy of participating in it. There's always that mix of coercion and consent. So I don't think you can ever live without hegemony, but I can think of ways in which we can make it more accountable and more democratic. So I certainly think that hasn't happened in South Africa, and absolutely needs to, particularly when it comes to land and when it comes to fencing. So, what's interesting here is, the land here is also feudal land. What's interesting about this story is that it happens in traditional land that has escaped the sort of microscope of the World Bank's land registries and cadastral surveys. I think that actually is an enabling condition of this of the experiment. But I also think that when one thinks about land in South Africa, or land anywhere, land reform is an important and a good thing. But land reform that then just creates small farms in which people carry on the same practices of domination as they did before is no good. So I think that if one's pushing back against fencing, one must push back not only against the technology of fencing, but the social technology of which it was a part. So the reason I introduced fencing at the beginning was to say fencing, along with debt, along with the power of exclusion, created an environment in which led us in various ways to the world we're in at the moment. If you just get rid of fencing but leave everything else intact, you're just going to have the same world that we're in. So I think when one thinks about a land reform that is inclusive, that is just, then you need not only to tackle the fences, but you also need to tackle the domains of productive and reproductive labor, the actions of agroecology and the possibilities of agroecology, questions of distribution, questions of energy. That's a way of sort of addressing the fences issue. And then what happens to corporations? What happens when corporations get interested in the land? Well, I think that was one of the challenges that I was leaving all of us with. I think that taking on corporate power is a particular responsibility of people in the global north, since that's where many of these corporations come from. And we have to protest. There was a photo that I was going to use of black bloc protests at the G8 that were trying to take on some of these effects of corporate power. But I think that it's very, very hard to get this kind of thing to work in land that's been privatized. And therefore, we have to fight privatization and we have to fight these corporations. But I think that calls for something that's a lot more revolutionary than perhaps we permit ourselves to think. But we have to think about something revolutionary because, if we don't, then we'll be left sort of twiddling the status quo a little bit. But it seems to me that ending corporate personhood, revoking corporate charters, some of the fantastic ideas that we were hearing earlier on today about transferring ownership from corporations to workers or even to stakeholders might be a terrific way of managing that. But we need that vision, and we need the sort of anger and the alternative vision of private property in order to make governments behave the way that they should.
Okay, shall we take a second round? I see already 3. Okay, so somebody will have to wait for a third round. I see Susan first, then Word, Mao, and the lady here. And then, for the third round, in that very same order. Susan.
Susan George, Natural Institute. now that this is a big success, is there an antithesis to the thesis? Is there a reaction to the action? In other words, has there been any effort from outsiders to move in and take over the fruits of their labors? Is the government trying to tax them more? If there's a surplus, what happens to that? Do they market it? Do they then share the income? I mean, if it is a success and they don't eat it all themselves, what happens then? And how do they integrate into the rest of the economy of Malawi?
Great question.
Well done to Gavin. Thank you, Raj, for the presentation. Just one little correction on what you said just now. South Africa has redistributed 5% of its land. The other 95% with 60,000 farms, now we're 60,000 farms, now they're 36,000 farms. So there's even more concentration than there used to be before the end of apartheid. That's not my question, it's to show us how bad we are off today, even worse than 10 years ago. You tend to speak about corporates and us, them and us. And I wanted to play a little game with you guys here. Who is buying its food from Woolworths, Spar, Pick and Pay, or whatever? Here. Only us? Only the few? Who is sourcing its food directly from an organic farm out here? Awesome. And I think there's only 3 or 4 really of us. What I mean with this, it's not them and us. It's we are part of the system and we are buying our food from these corporates. I'm the founder of a project called Land Matrix, and we're tracing all transnational and corporate land transactions in the world. And what we do there is we identify the primary investors, and these are the guys you mentioned, all the corporates. We also identify the secondary investors out there. And through not the corporatization, but the financialization process of our economy, these guys are now controlled by our banks, our investment funds, our pension funds, etc. And then we go to the tertiary investor. And who is behind the banks, the investment funds, the pension funds? It's our money. So entire society is embedded, and we are eating this food that you're talking about, etc. And I love to hear and I love to support initiatives like this, and we all do, and it's one of our tasks. But again, coming back to South Africa, where everything has been concentrated in the past years, where there's only 5 retailers controlling our entire food sector, I'm skeptic, and I'd like to hear your point of view. Is how can we really break? And it's nice initiatives, but it's fighting against the 5 bigs of South Africa or 10 bigs in the world that we ourselves are part of.
Next door, Mao. My question is about mechanisms for scaling up. You know, you talked about very interesting interventions, and if I look at, for example, what the leadership at the continental level, for example, the Malabo Declaration of Agricultural Transformation, the CADEP process, and so on, the African leaders are talking about transforming agriculture at scale. We're talking about millions of farmers that need to transition into these agroecological practices. But ultimately, it comes down to where is that funding going to come from, the funding mechanisms. How can we really operate at scale? So how do we transform our societies at scale? I would like to hear your insights on that.
Can't remember the lady here, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Tiko Chume, and I'm from Future Shop, and I'm Malawian. And I happened to be in Ekwendeni in December. Oh, cool. And I was helping some farmers there start to grow moringa, just to also supplement or fortify the nutritional needs. But clearly the outcome of the projects that you've spoken about, you can clearly see the effects of it in that there's a lot of food being produced, and the surplus is shipped to Mzuzu, which is sort of like the commercial hub which serves northern Malawi. So they've got this huge markets, and it's such a pleasure to go there in the morning and you see the ladies selling their produce, fresh, organic produce from from around Mzuzu. But the irony of it is about 4 years ago, ShopRite got into Malawi. And I was there on Christmas Eve. And the market was as empty as can be. And ShopRite was so packed, I couldn't even get into ShopRite to buy provisions we needed for Christmas Day. And on the shelves are Cape Fair carrots, Cape Fair brinjals, Cape Fair whatever. So it's vegetables and produce still being imported into Malawi from South Africa. That's just a comment that I wanted to share. And the second is, what is the role of, the second one is a question, what is the role of permaculture, food forestry, and regenerative agriculture in food sovereignty? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's, I'll take them in reverse. I think that when you have, La Via Campesina has a slogan, and like all Via Campesina slogans, it's a little cumbersome. But the slogan says that food sovereignty without agroecology is just a slogan, because you have food sovereignty, but if you've got nothing to distribute, then what good is being sovereign? Whereas and agroecology without food sovereignty is just a technology. Agroecology, I mean, it can be and is being in Brazil used by large-scale growers who are capitalists and just taking the stuff off the ground. They're using these fantastic techniques, but using the techniques not to feed local people, but just to be able to get more out of the soil and to make sure the soil is rich and save themselves input costs. And that's one of the things about agroecological farming is that while yields may be a little less in some cases than not this one, the costs of doing it are much lower. I mean, what goes up is labor costs, but input costs go way down. And so it becomes a technology for growing more stuff, and then you can just send it off to the export market. So the question has to be a relationship between these fantastic ways of growing things without using chemical inputs and governing. You can't have one or the other. You need them both together, because otherwise you grow stuff but you don't know how to distribute it, or if you've got a distribution plan but you've got nothing to distribute, you're stuffed. So it has to be both of these things fused together. But that's one of the things about agroecology or permaculture is that these are mechanisms that lend themselves well to being governed in these kind of anarchist ways, and that's sort of interesting. I mean, I think that they mesh together in ways that food sovereignty and agroecology can't be and shouldn't be separated. Though I'm pleased that you mentioned the fact that things are going well. I haven't been back there since August. But my understanding is that it is going well, and it helps people weather shocks like the huge floods that happened. It becomes a way for people to survive. But the state, interestingly, has been quite supportive of it, because it's, and this is one of the things of any kind of successful moment of resistance, it allows the state to escape its responsibilities, right? Because now the state doesn't have to worry about funding its agricultural extension services because it's got these women to do it for $8 a day. Sorry, $8 per person per year. So this becomes a way of evading. But there hasn't been a backlash because in large part, the land on which this is happening isn't the kind of land that is being zeroed in on by corporate masters. So the state is keen to make it happen, but the opportunity cost, of course, is the state really shirking its responsibilities. And of course, that's the thing of any kind of successful grassroots movement. It can just shore up neoliberalism rather than replace it. And that gets to Ward's question. I mean, I think that when you have corporate power as powerful as it is, I'm keen to see a state that is ready to take that on. I mean, you had the EFF with their populist is not a good word, by the way. Whenever anyone says populist, it says more about them than it says about what they're talking about. But you had the EFF's vision of economic nationalism, which is, I find it a problem. Because in the end, you're keeping large structures of the state, but you're not democratizing the processes of exchange. You're keeping the, sort of these large institutions, and you're just letting them carry on doing the crap that they're doing before, but now the nation profits. And I do think that a nation that is more willing to be active and break up monopolies, for example, is a very easy first step. Most states have anti-monopoly regulation on the books. President Obama promised to break monopoly concentration in the beef industry in the US, where I think it's 3 or 4 companies control 80% of the industry. But without a grassroots movement threatening government with something far more radical, then you'll never get that transformation. I mean, when you think about the New Deal, we're hearing about how fantastic the New Deal was in the United States. The Glass-Steagall Act that broke the commercial and retail banking, for example. Do people know about the Glass-Steagall Act? It was one of these things that was removed and led to the Great Recession. But before it happened, I mean, the origins of the Glass-Steagall Act were in the 1920s and 1930s, where the Great Depression happened in the United States, and people said, these banks have screwed us. We need not only to nationalize the banks, but to break them down completely. We need to transform finance. We need radical new visions for what finance should be. And what came out of that was the Glass-Steagall Act. It was just a compromise. Governments are always going to be compromising between the powerful and grassroots movements. And so it seems that if we want to clip the corporate power of South African capital, then we need to actually be much more revolutionary than movements for food justice have been of late. I mean, and this isn't to say, well, what we need is something like what happened in Zimbabwe. I think that land reform in Zimbabwe has been very good for the people who've been able to access that land, according to some indicators. But what hasn't happened is the democratization of the economy. I mean, it's happened in maybe 20% of things, and Sam Moyo's work there is very, very good. But I think that there's space for that much more radical transformation, and that means political organizing around revolutionary ideas. It's okay to say that, I think. I think that if we don't say that, then what are we left with? We're left with pleading for crumbs from the table. So let's just say, look, what we need is to be revolutionary, and it's okay to say that. It should be all right, because when we think about the kind of world we want, where the indicators measure social progress and measure social transformation, that world isn't this world. It's a revolutionary, different world. And so it's okay for us to own the fact that we are revolutionaries, and that should be where, I think we should permit ourselves to be bigger and more powerful than we allow ourselves to be. Does that answer? Yes. And scaling up. So, Mal, I'm glad that I left off on revolution, because there is a really interesting revolutionary organization in Brazil, the Brazilian Landless Rural Workers Movement, who have done great jobs in land occupation and agroecology training schools, and they've done that by occupying land, and they've settled over 1 million people. That's not a bad scale, and that figure's a little old. So I mean, this is an organization that seems to have mastered the idea of peer-to-peer organizing and organizing groups of communities, cells of families, and then sending them off onto land reform. But I also, the language of scaling up is often the sort of master's tools. I mean, if you're interested in scaling up, there are only certain things that are amenable to being scaled up in the way that where you pour money into them and then they grow bigger. But I don't think, community organizing gets watered that way. I don't think you water community organizing by throwing a crap ton of money at it. I think that actually, again, if you think about malnutrition in India being reduced through women's empowerment, that has happened at scale, but it hasn't happened in a way where the scaling up conversation fits. You see what I mean? Because the scaling up conversation is, give me this thing and then tell me, and then I will just institute this here, here, and here, and here. But it's happened in a much more distributed way through networks of feminist activists, as well as fights at the government level in order to be able to make education access available, and fights for 100 working days a year for every family in rural areas. I mean, these have been sort of coeval fights, but they've not been things where you throw money and then you see magical returns. And so I guess I would just want to caution this idea of scaling up. Not to say that agroecology can't be scaled. Agroecology can be scaled, but we need to think about the terms in which that happens.
Let's take another round. Wow. Okay, so we start from here, then we go back to the gentleman over there, then Michelle, and then Nick.
Well, Raj, you are very welcome in this country, or back in this country, because apparently you were here. My name is Thierry, and in fact, we are launching Agroecology Training Academy in this country, and that academy will be situated in Shaft 17 in Soweto, on the most polluted land in South Africa by acid main drainage, because we want to prove directly that, and we are proving it already because it's already done there, that not only it's a justice, but it's rehabilitation, and we reverse the pollution of the land at Shaft 17 by practicing agroecology. So first of all, your message is incredibly strong. And in the meantime, while we are doing this very quietly and no media, etc., because that's the way you do revolution, otherwise you get smashed, we have another group who is coming with new words, fantastic words like climate smart agriculture. You know, they call themselves. Would like to have your comments about all that's called conservation agriculture. And if you look closely about behind this, first of all, they're sponsored by Grain SA, which is a monopoly about grain in South Africa. And then what they advocate is say, no, but we produce all the food here, and what we're going to do over 20 years, we'll cut down on pesticide, we'll cut down on everything. But there's no change at all. It's just cosmetic. The only trouble is that, you know, when you are seeing agroecology, 90% of people here don't know agroecology. But within a year, nearly everybody knows conservation agriculture because they go through Pick and Pay to SPAR, you know, they do campaign and all these kind of things. So being a revolutionary like you are and like we are, because we're not afraid to say that we have to also oppose the emerging of new brands. You know, some people call themselves ecological agriculture, you know. But I think the trouble is that as soon as you talk about agriculture, it's related to a model which has destroyed our soil, etc. So we need to inform the public as a revolutionary, which is our duty, that these kind of organizations are cropping up and they cripple us because they take funds from FAO, in particular, and ARC also taking funds to promote, you know, better systems for whatever. So you are incredibly helping us because by putting a message like this, we are not small in our hole anymore. We have some worth. And then I would like to also finish by what you were saying, but from the fact that South Africans have produced incredible thinkers. And one of them is Steve Biko, by the way. And he has created something not really black, I call it consciousness. Because he said the best weapon of the oppressor is in the mind of the oppressed. And this is what you're saying. If we go to buy in Pick and Pay and you don't be conscious about what's happening, you will serve those interests by eating them. And so really from the heart here, Raj, you are very welcome. And we are thanking you from all the communities to which we teach agroecology. We are thanking you very much for that message. Powerful.
There at the back, Elias, yes.
Thank you. My name is Elias Isaac. I come from Angola. Just a question. Taking into consideration the success and the failure of Malawi in this project, because Malawi was seen as a poor country and suddenly Then we came to understand Malawi was transitioning from a poor to middle-income country and so on. The challenge, I want you to comment on the challenge of integration. Southern Africa has got one of the weakest region integration in the continent. given the fact that Angola buys, maize from Brazil, soybeans from South Korea, and so on, and a friend just mentioned about this vision that African leaders have about revamping the agricultural business. What role does integration will help to assist farmers like in Malawi that their produce is not wasted? Because right now you find in the villages in Angola, for example, people no longer farm beans. They prefer to buy tin beans. Thanks.
Here, first row.
Thanks, Raj, for that really inspiring example. I wonder if, instead of talking about scaling, we should talk about interconnection. And in the sense, my interpretation of the limitation of the project was that it only looks at a local situation, right? It's a good solution for them locally, but it doesn't touch the wider ecosystem. I just want to give a little witness because I spent a month in Catalonia as a guest of the Catalan Integral Cooperative. And so what I saw there was a real ecosystem of change where in every city in Catalonia that I visited, there are eco-jarjas and there are like economic networks where people come together every Friday and they exchange their goods. And it's textile, it's food, it's many different things. And they have their own internet infrastructure without internet service providers called Wi-Fi-net, where you basically just buy, a router and then you create your own internet yourself and you interconnect with your neighbors. And they have 80,000 nodes. And when they want energy, they connect with Som Energia, which is a renewable energy co-op. And so what's interesting there is that this actually already forms an ecosystem. And so, just imagining that those people in the village in Malawi, would connect with a consumer co-op that could invest in the, in upgrading the market. They would slowly build an ecosystem, right? It's not about scaling up, about building a big hierarchical organization that would suppress people. It's about finding, complementarities between different groups and then connecting them in an ecosystem. I'm sure you agree with that, but I think it's important to say it. Yeah, thank you.
Here, second row.
Thank you. Nick Budd, agricultural credit consultant. Raj, I wonder if you have witnessed in Malawi any evolution that's occurred as a result of the empowerment and organization of women around food distribution and basically creating a separate political power base in rural Malawi. Has that evolved any further into other issues? You have now this cadre of women who are used to organizing, are to a certain extent taking over power from the existing political base or elite, or however that manifests itself. Just anecdotally, I noticed during the last election in Malawi, the presidential election, the president, Joyce Banda, spent a great deal of time campaigning in the north, going from village to village by helicopter, distributing bags of fertilizer and seed to women. So you saw the crowd gathered around her were principally women, at least on television. So she must have considered that this was a constituency that was worthy of cultivating. She didn't win, of course, but nevertheless, it was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Those are great questions, I think that this question of politics and actually the articulation of politics with a broader understanding of the world that they've created, I think that's an open question. I mean, I agree, Michelle, of course, that connecting to a cooperative is a good idea, but I also think that there are, I mean, this is an ecosystem for innovation in that they've done financial services, they've done grain storage, they've done, small-scale micro-enterprise stuff. The climate change stoves are for the market. So this isn't, I mean, this is just to say, yes, this is, I mean, it's still early days in some ways, but then, the question is, well, how do outsiders, just to take John's question, how do outsiders engage with what is a place where people have recognized and named power in some ways, but are they naming it and recognizing it in other ways? And that's, I mean, I am uncomfortable with going in and talking about, well, have you thought about the means of production? Or coming in with these sort of socialist ideas. And I wonder, I mean, I haven't seen the endogenous political organizing happening because I haven't been looking for it. And in large part because understanding the dynamics of this project has meant that all the questions are asking about, well, so who's doing this, who's doing this, who's doing this? So I haven't asked, and I'm a bad person to ask about that. But I think it's an important question, and I'm curious about it, but I felt like I needed to get to the bottom of this before thinking about those other articulations. But I think it's a great question, and I welcome it. And I mean, I think but using this idea of interconnectedness helps to answer the regional integration question for sure, because it's been an anti-patriarchal organizing, a kind of anti-patriarchal organizing. But when we think about regional integration, if we just think of the great patriarchs who are the heads of the countries in the SADC region, we miss the kinds of cross-border exchanges that are already happening. I mean, the seeds for a lot of this come from Zimbabwe, from groups. In fact, a Via Campesina group is growing some of the seeds for to be exchanged with the Malawians because they want to be free of corporate seed networks. So I think in terms of answering a question of regional integration, again, I'm a bad person to ask about the sort of the great man kinds of stories of regional integration. But there are already sort of pathways of integration across borders because the ways in which those borders matter less for these kinds of farmer-to-farmer exchanges, and I think that's kind of exciting. But climate-smart agriculture is the enemy. I just very quickly want to just talk about that because climate-smart agriculture is this idea that we're not going to till the land and we're going to weed by spraying glyphosate, Monsanto's blockbuster chemical, onto the land. And the Economist has been going on about no-till for a long time, so it's wrong. But the Economist is very keen on no-till agriculture because when you look at the data, it appears that it's better at sequestering carbon than when you till in industrial agricultural practices. But that's the problem with all of this stuff. When you're told, well, you can till and have industrial agriculture, or you can not till and have industrial agriculture, then you choose not till. But you're given two shitty choices, and then sustainable agriculture or sustainable intensification is better than crappy intensification. But it's still following this industrial agricultural model. And I think that one of the great things about scientific research into agroecology is the data that's coming out about how much carbon sequestration this kind of farming can offer. Another Via Campesina slogan: "Small farmers cool the earth," and that refers to the kinds of soil sequestration, carbon sequestration in the soil that's possible through agroecological methods, rather than just planting your monocrop and spraying, which is what sustainable intensification is all about.
Before we start, I'm going to take in that final round. I just wanted to say something about regional integration as well on this. Yeah. Well, don't worry. There's time. Don't worry. And he's not leaving anyway. So we kept him for another day. So the one thing interestingly about regional integration that we've seen is that it's true that this region of the world has a very weak institutionalized form of regional integration, which is what scholars look for. Scholars come with their own lens, and when there are no institutions, they go back and say, there is no phenomenon here happening. But what we've seen at GovN is that when you stop coming with your own preconceived ideas of what regional integration is, you see that borders are porous, that people cross borders all the time. Some of the people probably that live work in your village may actually sell some of the surplus across borders in villages, or if they're next to the national border, even across countries. People speak the same languages, have the same names, often they come from the same families. So there is an intense phenomenon which we call bottom-up grassroots forms of regionalism, which is happening in this region, and it is often actually destroyed or attacked by a superimposition of a, let's say, Eurocentric way of understanding regional governance. So at Gavin, we do a lot of research in this regard, and I don't know if you see our deputy director around here, Kristen Shimby, right there. You can talk to him about everything. Is the guy crossing the borders illegally with the traders and so on and so forth? And he knows all the secrets about people, free movement, de facto free movement of traders across Southern Africa, which is an interesting phenomenon. Not to say that it's necessarily a positive thing, but it's definitely something that is happening. It has a huge potential if it was captured in a very innovative way. Now, let's start a final round of questions. Presidents to whoever hasn't spoken yet, Susan, so I'll take you last. Okay, so we're going to go, just a show of hands again. Show me your hands. So we're going to go from, wow, very quick. Lou, Jan, back there, the two of you, the gentleman, and then Lisa and Susan closing, and Alan, okay. Remember the names, remember the order in which I've pronounced your names. Lou starting.
Hi Raj, thanks a lot, that was fantastic. So given patterns, projections of population growth, and within that, urbanization of populations, so a situation where fewer and fewer people will be growing their own food, what is your vision for how we will feed people in the urban centers?
Back there.
Hi, Raj. Jan Schulte, University of Gothenburg. I just wanted to put your question to yourself. What is your theory of social change? Because I hear feminism, I hear Marxism, I hear Foucauldian stuff, I hear Gramscian counter-hegemony, I hear radical ecology, and at some point it all doesn't fit together, or does it? In which case, if you can tell me that answer, I'll be so relieved, because I don't know what to do myself.
So what was the order again? I think we moved to this side. The lady behind you? Yes. And then the gentleman.
Hi, Brittany Kesselman from University of KwaZulu-Natal. My question links a bit to the first one that was asked. You've given us a beautiful example of what food sovereignty looks like in a small rural community, but I'm wondering if you encountered any examples in your travels making the documentary in terms of what food sovereignty looks like in an urban space.
2 rows back.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Elvis Komani. I'm working for CNI, and I'm also an activist in South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Now what I want to submit, Raja, you are a powerful speaker, but there are simple terms and simple things that we must speak about. I think we need to become indigenous, original. So the fact that we are changed, we are something else, it's killing the whole global society. I think we understand where we are coming from back to our history, and then we know what happened. And Africa was free, like life is free. Good people, all animals are living free, and then even birds are living free. Why we as people have to pay? The distance that was taken from the West to Africa, when settlers came to Africa and turned African children into tenants in their own country, it's a question mark, and we really know where it went wrong. So we just need to speak the truth and maybe come to a point to say it's enough with the resources which were abstracted or taken out of Africa. We as Africa, we are no longer going to give something out. We are also expecting to receive something, because truly speaking, a lot has been dug and it's been saved somewhere. So we also need to find a way to go and collect it where it's hidden. Thank you.
So I had Alain, and then the gentleman over here, and then the 2 closing remarks.
I am Alain Billan. I worked at CIRAD and a close partner to Govin. This is a question about finance. You showed us an example from large corporates, but themselves, they have shareholders who come from huge funding, hedge funds, and so on. In our research center, we were questioned a few years ago by a large investment fund, itself backed up by an even larger bank, and saying, okay, we would like to develop a portfolio of several million US dollars or euro on agroecology. Could you help us? And I can tell you we haven't found the answer yet, because we couldn't find a way, especially because they said we want to be competitive on the market of business, and we want to raise 12% income from the investment we make. And we couldn't find a way to develop this such high income from agroecology at the moment. The question it raises is that there are hundreds of billions of US dollars turning around the planet every day in the stock markets. These people would invest where there is possible profit. At the moment, I think the voice they hear most is from the industry you showed us, probably, which promises this kind of income. Could part of the revolution might be to give attractive views on these investors on other pathways. Otherwise, I mean, money will not come. We will remain at small-scale tentative projects which are difficult to scale up. So maybe $100 million, you divide by 20,000 ones, that's a lot of villages that could be helped, maybe. That could be part of the solution. But what would be your thoughts about finance? And you might have interesting examples also in mind that could show that there are good promises in the right directions, maybe, hopefully.
Who's next? The gentleman here.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Thabo Kwebo from Traffic Barricade. I want to know from you, Mr. Patel, what can you give us in terms of feedback, in terms of trying to equip the people down there on the ground, on those local communities in the rural area, in terms of skills development, in terms of giving them the necessary skills so that in the long term they are sustainable, so that whatever you come back after 10 years or 20 years down the line, you find the people they are well equipped with the necessary skills and they are sustainable in terms of doing the agricultural the better way. Because I feel that we have seen here in South Africa that there is the exchange of giving back land to us as African, but the black people, but what we are lacking is the skill. You can give me the money, but if I don't have the skill, it's something else, because I will still not turn that land in a profitable as the other man was. But if I have the skills and then you give me the money, obviously you'll see me, tomorrow have moved a distance from point A to B. Yes. Thanks.
Susan George. Mike.
Raj, could you update us on Bill Gates and the Agri program and tell us if the good guys can win or not? Is Bill Gates the future or the past?
And then Lise.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for your presentation and thoughtful and a wonderful example of how change in social fiber for society can happen in a community context of Malawi. I wanted to ask you who owned the land. And then I want to take you back to South Africa and the land issue. And yes, it's sensitive, it's political. And we are debating it, and there's a lot of statistics of effective use of land and are we using the land. But while we arm wrestling land issues, someone else walked away with the lion's share, and that's the mining industry. And if you look at our ability to produce food, that's severely challenged. So the issue is much more complex. And that takes me to food and this morning's presentations, which I thought was brilliant, excellent. The index and the values. Do we value our planet? And with that, I want to ask you, do you think we value our food? Because it's difficult to produce food. If I give a packet of seeds to everyone here tonight, I wonder if they'll be able to produce a proper plate of food. Because as we produce food on marginal lands, it's a challenge. We have pests and diseases that'll never go away. We have to control that. We lose a lot between from the point of harvest to consumption, and we don't eat a lot. So tonight, I wonder how many people will finish their plates. So, do we value our food?
So some easy questions to end with.
Just 20 of them.
Yeah. Well, the easiest, of course, Bill Gates. Bill Gates could be the nicest person in the whole damn world, and he could have absolutely all the answers. But the fact is that he's a philanthropist who's utterly unaccountable. And that is, there's something very wrong with this picture, where one guy who's made all his money out of a very large monopoly then gets to shape agriculture policy for, hundreds of millions of people. So I don't care if he's doing the right thing. I think that the mechanism through which he's doing it is an abomination, and it shouldn't. I mean, why is he so rich in the first place? This is the problem I have with philanthropy: is how did you get all this money? It seems to me that it ought to have been taxed away long ago. So I think that, and obviously, Comrade Gates is pushing forward an agenda that is very much aligned with the USAID kind of micro-locals, small-scale agricultural entrepreneurs buying Monsanto seed. So I don't see it. I don't see his vision as particularly progressive. I mean, he did have he was stung by the criticism that gender didn't feature in his in the agricultural strategy. So they went through the agricultural strategy and added "and women." To all the, to the appropriate bits, and that's their new agricultural strategy. So it doesn't seem to me to be that he's accountable, or there's something wrong with that picture. In terms of food sovereignty at an urban, at a national level, there's a fantastic report called the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development. ISTAD is how you pronounce that. They didn't go to acronym school, these people. It's a tremendously interesting report because it says, look, by 2050, how will we eat? And it was funded by the World Bank, among others. And you would expect a report like that to say, well, we need sustainable intensification. But what it calls for is more urban and peri-urban farming. And that's good and bad, right? I mean, if you look at who does urban and peri-urban farming now, 40% of Cubans do urban farming. And in Latin America, 20% of Guatemalans, I think, do it. And the reason they do it is because they are poor and because they have very little access to other means of securing food. But there's still something very interesting about urban and peri-urban farming that you can imagine happening at when food is valued properly, to get to Lisa's point, that actually would be an important stream of income. But you do need to reconfigure and reimagine what urban geography looks like. And one does need to imagine not just farming in mega cities, but also the small and medium cities where most of the world's urban population are going to live. I mean, we're preoccupied about Delhi or about Shanghai or about these mega cities, but most people who are living, most of the world's urban population don't live in those cities. They live in small and medium-sized cities where there's room to play with ideas of urban and peri-urban farming. At a national level, there are a lot of countries that have adopted the idea of food sovereignty, and it is in the constitutions of a few. Trouble is, what that plays out as is still a work in progress. And that's, again, good and bad. I mean, can I point to a country that unambiguously is food sovereign? Well, I don't think so. I mean, in part, that's because the nation state is maybe part of the problem. But it's also, it's also the case that the food sovereignty itself is a work in progress. And this is how I both dodge and answer your question. Around my theory of change. I mean, what I like about La Via Campesina's idea of food sovereignty is initially it started off as the World Trade Organization is bad, and so is Monsanto, which remains true. But what food sovereignty has become through this sort of dialectical process of organizing through the peasant movements has been embracing feminism much more than it ever did. I mean, initially, feminism didn't really feature in the definition of food sovereignty. Now it's kind of a central part of that definition of food sovereignty. And it happened because movements were engaged in on-the-ground struggles and on-the-ground politics. Now, if I were a Trotskyist, I would be able to offer you a very simple answer of revolution, which is that the workers must seize the means of production and then they will control the state. I'm not a Trot, and I don't have the answers. But it seems to me that there are a lot of movements that are converging on the answers. And I want to talk about, well, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of the project I'm working on with a guy called Jason Moore. You saw some of the cheaps up there, the cheap things. We've kind of gone for 7 cheap things. There are 7 cheap things that capitalism that depends on. We saw cheap workers who need cheap food and cheap fuel, cheap care, cheap nature, cheap credit, and cheap lives. Now, we chose those because actually the way capitalism works has cheapened all of those things. But it's also the case that in all of those things, there are social movements fighting to reverse those processes. So if you think about cheap lives and everything from Black Lives Matter to Idle No More to movements that want to reclaim but also redefine indigeneity have become tremendously important. So rather than just a kind of, we need to go back to the 17th century because it was terrific then, they're taking and reconstructing ideas of what it is to be indigenous in ways, particularly in Canada, that are mind-blowing. And they're articulating very directly with indigenous nationalism and a very inclusive indigenous nationalism, two ideas of what the new economy would look like. But then, so you've got Lives, you've got Occupy that's very much interested in debt. Debt relief, by the way, I think is, if there's one policy that we had to pick in order to be able to make all of this stuff happen, debt relief is important because it allows thinking space. Debt relief for all of us to be able, hands up if you are not in debt. There we go. Mazel tov. Most people, and certainly most countries find themselves, in the global south, find themselves in debt. And that means that there are certain pathways of industrial agriculture and of capitalism that they're wedded to. Debt relief is not a fix-all proposition, but it allows a space to be able to imagine a different world. And certainly that's true when we look at the studies coming out of, I can't remember this guy, the South Indian economist at Harvard, who does stuff on what scarcity does to the brain. If you're constantly worrying about debt, you don't have the space to think about what the world should look like tomorrow because you're constantly worrying about it today. So debt relief, that's what, so cheap money. Cheap food, of course, we have all these movements fighting cheap food. Cheap nature, we've got many movements here that want to redefine our relationship to climate. Cheap care, you have the domestic workers organizing in the United States to value women's unpaid labor. You have cheap work, so you have the $15 an hour movement in the United States that's spreading globally, and you have Piketty's work on global maximum, global minimum wage. You have all of these movements that have the seeds of fighting the same problem, the 7 cheap things. And so my response is to say, look, these movements have within them the possibility of articulating with one another. We've seen it happen to an extent with La Via Campesina, where you have radical ecology, feminism, and anti-capitalism melding. But you have many, many more people engaging in counter-hegemonic work. And it seems to me that there's an open future to be able to stitch them together and taking on finance so that the kind of finance that matters is not the finance that comes from the men in nice suits from Crédit Agricole, but actually getting back to Crédit Agricole's original roots of actually sort of cooperative lending. So I think that this is a way for me to say, actually, yes, I think radical feminism is a great idea. I think radical ecology is a great idea. I think radical democracy is a great idea. And I think that the way we live and work those things is not by anyone charting out the solution about the worker state, but by working within movements as they are and getting those conversations going together so that we can abolish the 7 cheap things and live in a world where the skills that we need are taught peer-to-peer and where we get to value our food and where we get to live together, not in peace, well, not in harmony, because peace is not about everyone being hippie and getting along. Peace is about people being able to have a conflict and get over it. And I think that living in that kind of world where you have these kinds of disagreements and conflicts, but where we can that's what I like about this Malawi example, by the way. What it shows is that patriarchy can be overcome through conflict, and what you have here is a peace of a kind. It's not a peace where there's where people are where there hasn't been upheaval, but there's been transformation here. And so I fully warrant that this is a small-scale example of one particular thing happening in one particular place, but it pulls together so many of the skills that we will need to be able to make this kind of radical transformation happen. So my theory of change is that yes, it's grassroots driven, it's anti-capitalist, but it's also it's working where people are at. It's working through these movements for change and articulating them in that Marxist sense, to be able to imagine a radical future through a process of what La Via Campesina calls food sovereignty, other people call radical democracy. Thank you very much.